Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you for having me here. So this is a very different kind of presentation from the two that we've had already. It's almost entirely historical and almost entirely exegetical as well. You will get a sense of some reservations I have about the perspective I'm talking about, but its interest is in, I hope, in presenting the work of the fairly famous but now neglected Hungarian philosopher, chemist, Michael Polanyi, in terms of Gestalt psychology, because this was undoubtedly one of the main formative influences in his work. So Polanyi knew about the Gestalt psychology of perception, primarily. He didn't have a deep knowledge of it. He doesn't refer to any of the research papers, but he's reading the main books produced by Köhler and Kafka, for example. And his work led him, I shall argue, from Gestalt psychology of perception into two disparate philosophical fields. The first one will surprise you somewhat. It's to political philosophy. So Polanyi picks up the term dynamic order from Wolfgang Köhler's book, used by Köhler, he says, for an ordered arrangement resulting from spontaneous mutual adjustment of the elements. And he also speaks about spontaneous ordering of units in complex social systems. And Polanyi was one of the two people who developed this idea into the concept of spontaneous order, which later, in the hands of Friedrich Hayek, became one of the most important tools wielded by a certain sort of liberal political thinker in the mid-20th century. But given the complexity of this, the complexion of this conference, you'll be unsurprised. I'm not going to go into that any further. So the second route is what I'm going to focus on. This is through a new Gestalt epistemology, as Polanyi conceived it, to a position that ultimately ends up running alongside phenomenology, and then onwards to a kind of metaphysics or ontology, which Polanyi himself considered to have gone beyond phenomenology. This is the route that I will be describing. So the Gestalt psychology of perception, specifically, was one of the most identifiable inspirations behind Polanyi's philosophical work from the late 1930s onwards. He saw scientists and philosophers backing away from the implications of Gestalt psychology generally, and he proposed instead in, for example, his magnum opus, Personal Knowledge, book published in 1958, to take those implications seriously. So this is the way he introduces the book in the preface. I've used the findings of Gestalt psychology as my first clues to conceptual reform. Scientists have run away from the philosophical implications of Gestalt. I want to countenance them uncompromisingly, he says. So how did he do this? I'm going to look at four respects in which one might think that he has done so. Actually, we're only going to cover three because I don't have time to do the fourth aspect, the metaphysics. So we'll look at the first three topics on this list. The first way in which Polanyi might be thought to countenance the findings of Gestalt psychology is in the fact that he makes common cause with the Gestalt psychologists against certain sorts of empiricist, positivist, mechanical, and atomistic approaches to the mind and to science. This critique is merely an aspect of Polanyi's underlying opposition to what he called scientific rationalism and to what he thought of as its distorted ideal of objectivity. So the Gestalt psychologists and Polanyi, at least, if not the phenomenologists, proposed to deal with a perceived crisis in science by offering a reformed conception of science, a conception that would, in the words of Mitchell Ash in his History of Gestalt Psychology here, a conception that would do justice to the meaning and value in human experience and thus overcome the divide between the natural and the human sciences. Although I've quoted Mitchell Ash, we have two speakers here who've also published on the very same crisis, and I could have quoted certainly from Professor Hatfield's paper on the same subject. So, pitting himself against contemporary philosophies of science, Polanyi declared this starting point for his theory of knowledge. Upon examining the grounds on which science is pursued, I saw that its progress is determined at every stage by indefinable powers of thought. No rules can account for the way a good idea is found for starting an inquiry, and there are no firm rules either for the verification or the refutation of the proposed solution of a problem. So you can see immediately what a distance he's taking from contemporary 20th century, mid-20th century philosophy of science in this respect. Polanyi insisted generally that only relatively superficial aspects of scientific activity could ever be formalized or made explicit. And therefore, to the principles of scientific rationalism, as he called it, he gave very short shrift. Indeed, his arguments against it are probably don't even deserve that name. They are really just points. So, for example, he considers the ideals of scientific rationalism meaningless. One of them would be the mechanistic explanation of the universe in the sort of Laplacian vision. He says this is a meaningless ideal, not because of the principle of indeterminacy from quantum mechanics, but because the prediction of all atomic positions in the universe would not answer any question of interest to anybody. And as to the naturalistic explanation of morality, it must ignore and so by implication deny the very existence of human responsibility. It too is absurd. But Polanyi was no enemy of science. Indeed, I omitted to say in my introduction, I should have said, that he was primarily in his own work a physical chemist and came close to winning a Nobel Prize for his work in that subject. He'd only turned to philosophy later in his life. Science, he admitted, is the only uncontested intellectual authority. But what he wanted to do was to reform science, or at least reform the way we look at science, by, for example, stripping it of what I think Wittgenstein, for example, would call its prose. So Polanyi is primarily concerned to stress that scientists are all doing the right kind of thing, but they have a wrong conception of what they're doing. And the wrong conception is the conception dominated by positivist and mechanical philosophies. Right? So, for example, when it comes to biology and psychology, they, he argues, must be emancipated from the scourge of physicalism, it just means materialism in this context, and our current false version of the ideal of objectivity, this is his main concern, impersonal objectivity, must be replaced by a more modest, human, perspectival and personal version of that same ideal. So you don't give up on the notion of objectivity, but you refuse to conceive objectivity in the sort of Cartesian terms that people like Bernard Williams gave expression to when he talked about the absolute conception of the world. That's what Polanyi thinks is a meaningless ideal, not to be striven for at all. Secondly, Polanyi endorsed and sought to generalize from some of the basic features and findings of the Gestalt psychologists. So following the work of Köhler in particular, he portrayed perception as having properties incompatible with atomistic, cognitivist, and intellectualist approaches. So 4 features here. Firstly, for Polanyi, perception is holistic. So he says things like this: we owe to Gestalt psychology much of the available evidence showing that perception is a comprehension of clues in terms of a whole. What does this mean? It means that there's a relationship of antagonism between wholes and parts, between the perception of entire things and the perception of the particulars that somehow compose them. So here, I'll take one of these two quotations. The classic theme of Gestalt psychology is that the particulars of a pattern or a tune must be apprehended jointly, because if you observe the particulars separately, they form no pattern or tune. Second feature, perception is, as he puts it repeatedly, unspecifiable. Right? So he says things like this: Gestalt psychology has taught us that we can know a whole without being able to specify its parts. This is how we recognize a physiognomy without being able to, a face, without being able to tell what the signs are by which we recognize it. This is also how we exercise a skill. And this second feature, unspecifiability, gives rise to a third, which is that perception, according to Polanyi, involves intuition. Right? Not a special infallible faculty, but nevertheless a kind of mental faculty. So he says, some of the characteristic features of the propositions of science exclude the possibility of deriving these by definite operations applied to primary observations in a kind of empiricist model. And the process of their discovery must involve an intuitive perception of the real structure of natural phenomena. He is a kind of realist, but a realist of a strange kind to us. And fourthly and finally, perception for Polanyi is rooted in the body. Right? And here's another connection with phenomenology. So he says various things about this. Let's just focus on this one. The way the body participates in the act of perception can be generalized to include the bodily roots of all knowledge and thought. And he does want to take this quite seriously, I think. At this point, he, for example, makes a nod to Merleau-Ponty's, as he puts it, vivid and elaborate description of the way we experience our body and his resulting portrayal of our experience of our body as, quote, an existential act not based either on observation or on explicit thought. And he thinks that Merleau-Ponty, writing a decade before, I guess, has foreshadowed his own analysis in these respects. We'll see further connections with phenomenology later on. Polanyi's work also prefigures, in a vague way, the ideas familiar from modern cognitive science that our minds are scaffolded by external resources and that our cognition is embodied. So, for example, when we use a tool or a probe, and above all, when we use language in speech, reading, or writing, we extend our bodily equipment and become more effective and more intelligent beings. Right? I mean, this sounds kind of like Andy Clark, you know? All human thought comes into existence by grasping the meaning and mastering the use of language. Little of our mind lives in our natural body. A truly human intellect dwells in us only when our lips shape words and our eyes read print. Thirdly, and for my purposes here most importantly, Polanyi sought to extend Gestalt psychology by transforming it into an epistemology, and he several times in his works discusses things in exactly this term. So, for example, sensory perception, and particularly the way we see things, has supplied Gestalt psychologists with material for their fundamental discoveries, which I am expanding here into a new theory of knowledge. Or what we have to add to the findings of Gestalt psychology, what do we have to add to the findings of Gestalt psychology in order to transfer them into a theory of knowledge? And his answer is what we're going to look at in a moment, the distinction between two kinds of knowing, tacit and explicit. So Polanyi, I think, can be thought of as having tried to extend Gestalt psychology into epistemology in two directions or ways. Firstly, to forms of knowing other than perception, most notably to the kinds of knowing involved in everyday skills and our use of tools and probes. And secondly, to science. I'll probably only have time to talk about the first. Polanyi is now known, if at all, mainly as somebody who contributed to philosophy of science or as somebody who contributed the notion of tacit knowing. So there's recent debate about Ryle and knowing how, and by people like Williamson and Stanley. He can still be thought of as contributing to that debate, but he's mainly now thought of as a philosopher of science. Before we look at these extensions, or at least the first one though, I'm going to introduce their vehicle, which is the centerpiece of Polanyi's philosophy, and this is what he calls his theory of tacit knowing. This can be thought of as a Gestalt epistemology, because it takes the figure-ground relationship as the model for all knowing. So Polanyi's starting point is the observation that, as he repeatedly puts it, there are things that we know but cannot tell, or, in another way of putting it, we know more than we can tell. And he took Gestalt psychology to have shown that what we're aware of in perception must always go beyond what we can report on. Thinking of this in terms of figure and ground, the ground is what we are, in Polanyi's terms, tacitly aware of. For example, in the case of physiognomy, when looking at somebody's face, the individual facial features. Yeah? And our tacit awareness of that ground, of those features, is a necessary precondition for our focal awareness of the figure, the face itself in this instance. So Polanyi puts this in terms of his distinction between focal and subsidiary awareness, and says things like this. Gestalt psychology has proved we cannot focus our attention on the particulars of a whole without impairing our grasp of the whole. Yeah, if you try and look at the individual features of a person's face, you, as it were, lose the focus on the face itself. And that conversely, we can focus on a whole only by reducing our awareness of the particulars to the contribution they make to the whole. We may call the latter a subsidiary awareness of the particulars in terms of our knowledge of the whole that is subserved by them. Polanyi took this Gestalt epistemology, the distinction between focal and subsidiary awareness and some other apparatus, to apply very widely, right? To perception, to scientific discovery, to our understanding of physiognomies, including facial features, but not limited to those, to our relationships with tools and probes, such as, for example, an example he discusses repeatedly, our use of a cane to navigate around a room, for example, to our knowledge of other minds, and to the problem of universals. Indeed, one of the weaknesses of his philosophy, I think, is the way in which he tries to extend this apparatus so widely. His claims for the extent of this, as he calls it, tacit dimension, were extremely grand. So, for example, in different parts of his work, one finds him claiming all knowledge is rooted in tacit knowing, all understanding is tacit, the inarticulate meaning of experience is the foundation of all explicit meaning, all explicit thought is based on tacit knowing. The tacit dimension for Polanyi is the key to epistemology, I would say. So one of the better known aspects of his work is the way in which he applied his theory of tacit knowing to bodily skills, most notably those involving tools and probes. And he took Gestalt psychology to have already shown the continuity underlying this extension, so he says. The kinship between the process of tool using and that of achieving or perceiving a whole has already been so well established by Gestalt psychology that it may be taken for granted. He took advantage of this underlying continuity to argue that the same epistemology applies across these domains. So, for example, in the cases of muscular skills, like piano playing, for example, and of skillful knowledge, he says, we are aware of a multitude of parts in terms of a whole, and this submerging of the parts in the whole may be described as a subsidiary awareness of the parts within a focal awareness of the whole. Here's a longer quotation, again from Personal Knowledge. This is a quotation about tool use. So when we use a hammer to drive in the nail, we attend to both the nail and the hammer, but in a different way. We watch the effects of our strokes on the nail and try to wield the hammer so as to hit the nail most effectively. When we bring down the hammer, we do not feel that its handle has struck our palm, although it has of course, but that the head of the hammer has struck the nail. Yet in a sense, we are certainly alert to the feelings in the palm of our hand. They guide us in handling it effectively, and the degree of attention that we give to the nail is given to the same extent, but in a different way, to the feelings in the palm of our hand. The difference may be stated by saying that the latter are not, like the nail, objects of our attention. They're not what we're focusing on. They are instruments of our attention. They're not watched in themselves. And so you have a subsidiary awareness of the feeling in the palm of your hand merged into the focal awareness of driving the nail with the hammer. And one of the most important theses about focal and subsidiary awareness that Polanyi comes up with is that these things are mutually exclusive. You can't both focus on, if your focus is hammering the nail, you can't competently focus on the feelings in the palm of your hand at the same time, because if you do, you miss the nail, right? It's the destruction of the activity that he's interested in here. It's important that you must be alive to the feelings in the palm of your hand, but you must not focus on them. You've got to keep your focus as the hammer coming down onto the head of the nail. So with a given object as the focus of your attention, you cannot at the same time attend to those features or clues, subsidiary awareness of which is facilitating your focal awareness. And here he says the same thing in terms of the pianist example, which I think is famously one of his most famous examples of destructive analysis, as he would call it. Yeah. Polanyi also extended Gestalt psychology to the kinds of knowing involved in science, but I think I'm not got time to talk about those, so I'm going to skip a few slides if you'll allow me to. And I can't also talk about the fourth aspect of the way in which he used Gestalt psychology. I'll mention it in a moment, but from his epistemology and intertwined with it, Polanyi constructed a kind of metaphysics according to which reality is stratified into layers, and the layers are made into layers by this relationship of between subsidiary and focal awareness. Polanyi compared his project and some of its metaphysical conclusions to the work of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty in a positive way. So, for example, he invited his readers to call his theory of non-explicit thought, quote, a phenomenology of science and knowledge, by reference to Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. Husserl, he perceived, had made a systematic attempt to safeguard the content of unsophisticated experience against the effects of destructive analysis. So the enemy here is the empiricist picture in which destructive analysis destroys the phenomena that we're interested in, the meaningful phenomena. Yeah? And Merleau-Ponty, in his Phenomenology de la Perception, had later derived its bearing on the mind-body problem. But Polanyi considered that there was something missing in phenomenology. So when he looked at Merleau-Ponty's works, for example, he says, this foreshadows my own analysis, but I don't find among them the logic of tacit knowing, the apparatus of subsidiary and focal awareness and their relationships, nor the theory of ontological stratification, the metaphysics, which I regard as indispensable for the understanding of the phenomena described by Merleau-Ponty. So while he sympathized with the phenomenological method, in a way, not the epoche, the bracketing kind of thing, and he strongly endorsed its anti-reductionist conclusions, he ended up in a similar sort of situation, he contended that phenomenologists had not gone far enough. So, for example, Merleau-Ponty, again, he anticipates the existential commitment in tacit knowledge, but he does so without recognizing the triadic structure which determines the functions of this commitment, the way in which it establishes our knowledge of a valid coherence. So he says the contrast between explicit inference and an existential experience imbued with intentionality is not sufficient for defining the structure and works of tacit knowing. What we're missing in phenomenology, according to Polanyi, strangely enough, I think, as an objection, is a constructive system. He also took issue with phenomenologists, among others, for accepting existing ways of distinguishing between the natural and the social sciences. So he thought of them as acquiescing in a positivistic or mechanistic view of the natural sciences, not the Geisteswissenschaften, of course, but the natural sciences. So, for example, existentialists, who he picked on, especially in this connection, he thought of as accepting, but then as reducing to absurdity, the usual mechanistic way of looking at science and the world. The existentialist for Polanyi is the person who says, yeah, maybe natural science is right about the natural world. There's no meaning in it, and therefore surely it must be absurd. But for Polanyi, the absurdity they perceived, the existentialists perceived in the world, was to him an artifact of them having chosen the wrong starting points. So for him, the mechanistic conception of the world is not where you want to start. Where he detected this line of thinking, he's concerned to refuse that starting point by arguing more radically than they had that all research is unformalizable, uncodifiable, in virtue of being grounded in tacit knowing. And where these thinkers posited a hard distinction between the natural and the social sciences, or to the extent that they did so, Polanyi explicitly wanted to blur that boundary, arguing that differences between the natural and the human sciences were merely differences in the degree to which their objects are, as he puts it, indwelt. Right. And this brings me to a genuine parallel, I think, with existentialist phenomenology, the notion of indwelling. His idea of indwelling begins from his theory of tacit knowing in its application to our use of tools and probes. So he says the term indwelling here applies in a logical sense as affirming that the parts of the external world that we interiorize function in the same way as our body functions when we attend from it to things outside. In this sense, we live also in the tools and probes which we use, and likewise in our intellectual tools and probes. So in certain of his more flowery passages, Polanyi talks about the way in which we pour ourselves into the tools and probes we skillfully use. And he seems to take this seriously in a way that kind of ties up with the idea of the extended mind, as we'll see in a moment. So, as in phenomenology, this idea then gets applied to our own existence. We may say that our own existence, which we experience, and the world that we observe are interwoven. Bodily being, by participating subsidiarily in one's perceptions and actions, becomes a being in the world, while external observations and projects subsidiarily involving one's own bodily feelings become, up to a point, a self-transformation, an existential choice. And Polanyi, at this point, makes himself the connection, not with phenomenology, but, if we can distinguish this, with existentialism. So he relates it to the secessionist thinkers, Wilhelm Dilthey and Theodor Lipps, who he's interested in, but also to Jean-Paul Sartre. Despite his use of the term being in the world, he doesn't, in this connection, mention Heidegger. He seems to be more taken with Sartre. So, Polanyi's work, as we've seen, contains an anticipation of modern attempts to conceive of cognition as scaffolded and embodied. Whether he could have accepted the further idea of the extended mind, though, isn't so clear. But I'm just going to discuss this in 3 or 4 slides with reference to a short article that Tony Camero has published. That's yourself, is it? Hi. So in this article, Tony Camero has recently argued that the case of using a cane to navigate one's way around, which is an example that Polanyi uses in many instances, is preferable to the way that Andy Clark and David Chalmers, in their famous example of Otto, develop the extended mind thesis. So Camero thinks that it's preferable, as he puts it, the central exemplar of the extended mind. And I'm very sympathetic to this. Camero is, in this place, concerned to block a certain move against the extended mind thesis, the move which insists that people like Otto, so just to remind you of the Clark and Chalmers example, Otto is the person who uses a notebook to navigate his environment, which seems to be New York in their example, whereas Inge is the person who remembers, right? Otto's memory has deteriorated to such an extent that he has to write meaningful information in his notebook and, as we would intuitively say, remind himself about the location of places like the Museum of Modern Art, whereas Inge remembers where the Museum of Modern Art is. Clark and Chalmers argue that there's a functional equivalence, an isomorphism between the two cases. There's nothing really relevantly different. And one of the moves against them, which Tony Camero is concerned to refute at this point, is to say, oh no, Otto's access to this information is via perception. He has to look at his notebook, right? Whereas Inge does not have to look at her memory in the relevant sense. So this is a move against the extended mind thesis, and is supposed to wreck the isomorphism or analogy that Clark and Chalmers are trying to develop. Camero blocks this move by saying that the cane user does not perceive the cane, but perceives with it, right? So he ends up with a more modest extended mind thesis, according to which, to quote him, minds are not widely dispersed, not as widely as Clark and Chalmers think, right? The non-biological bits of the extended mind are limited to things you control so effectively that they recede from your awareness and come to feel like part of you. So perhaps not Otto's notebook, but perhaps the cane, if I'm a skilled user of the cane to navigate around the room. Perhaps I'm blind or something like that. So I find this quite congenial. I think it fits with the things that Polanyi says about indwelling and interiorizing things. Polanyi would agree with Camero that we do perceive with the cane, since for him it's the relevant features of the environment that we perceive focally, or that we are aware of focally. And our use of the cane is, of course, in this example, essential to that perception. Whether Polanyi could describe things in the way Camero does then depends on whether the subsidiary awareness of the cane, which Polanyi insists on, counts as perceiving it. And actually, when I look at his writings, I find that that's not the way Polanyi talks. He never talks about subsidiary awareness as being perception, right? It's awareness, but it's not perceptual awareness for him. So Polanyi doesn't talk of subsidiary perception, and therefore I think there's no disagreement that these people can join forces in this respect. So, I've argued that Polanyi has a good claim to have developed a Gestalt epistemology. It has to be said, though, that his published works do not show him to have had an in-depth knowledge of Gestalt psychology. As I said before, he does not refer to the research papers at all. He's very much concerned with the books that Köhler published on the mentality of apes and Gestalt psychology. Also, Kafka's book is one that he knows. He occasionally refers to Gestalt psychological literature outside that range, but not very much. He's very much focused on those presentations which, and primarily on Köhler's book on Gestalt psychology, which in a way already try to develop a philosophy from Gestalt psychology. So my claim is not that Polanyi worked out the philosophy of Gestalt psychology. I'm skeptical as to whether there could even be such a thing, but only that he took it as the basis of a philosophy, and that was the one he endorsed.